am going to be reading from the book West with the Night. It's written by Beryl Markham. It's a paperback covered novel that I got from Chapters Indigo. The cover is kind of sunset colors with a picture of African plains and an airplane flying over them, as well as kind of an inset of a photograph of Beryl Markham. Book 1, Chapter 1. How is it possible to bring order out of memory? I should like to begin at the beginning, patiently, like a weaver at his loom. I should like to say, this is the place to start. There can be no other. But there are 100 places to start, for there are 100 names. Mwanza, Serengeti, Nungwe, Molo, Nakuru. There are easily 100 names, and I can begin best by choosing one of them. Not because it is first, nor of any importance in a wildly adventurous sense, but because here it happens to be turned uppermost in my logbook. After all, I am no weaver. Weavers create. This is remembrance, revisitation, and names are keys that open corridors no longer fresh in the mind, but nonetheless familiar in the heart. So the name shall be Nungwe, as good as any other, entered like this in the log, lending reality, if not order, to memory. Date, June 16th, 1935. Type aircraft, Avro Avian. Markings, VP-KAN. Journey, Nairobi to Nungwe. Time, 3 hours, 40 minutes. After that comes pilot, self, and remarks, of which there were none, but there might have been. Nungwe may be dead and forgotten now. It was barely alive when I was there in 1935. It lay west and south of Nairobi, on the southernmost rim of Lake Victoria, Nyanza, no more than a starveling outpost of grubby huts, and that only because a weary and discouraged prospector one day saw a speck of gold clinging to the mud on the heel of his boot. He lifted the speck with the tip of his hunting knife and stared at it until it grew in his imagination from a tiny, rusty grain to a nugget, and from a nugget to a fabulous steak. His name eludes the memory, but he was not a secretive man. In a little while, Nungwe, which had been no more than a word, was both a Mecca and a mirage, so that other adventurers like himself discounted the burning heat of the country, the malaria, the black water, the utter lack of communications except by foot through the forest trails, and went there with shovels and picks, and quinine and tinned food with high hopes, and began to dig. I never knew what their digging got them. them anything, because when I set my small biplane down on the narrow runway they had hacked out of the bush, it was night, and there were fires of oil-soaked rags burning in bent chunks of tin to guide my landing. There's not much to be seen in light like that. Some dark, upturned faces, impassive and patient, half-raised arms beckoning, the shadow of a dog slouching between the flares. I remember these things and the men who greeted me at Nungwe, but I took off again after dawn without learning anything about the success of their operations or the wealth of their mine. It wasn't that they meant to keep these things concealed. It was just that they had other things to think about that night, and none of them had to do with gold. I had been working out of Nairobi as a freelance pilot with the Muthaiga Country Club as my headquarters. Even in 1935, it wasn't easy to get a plane in East Africa, and it was almost impossible to get very far across the country without one. There were roads, of course, leading in a dozen directions out of Nairobi. They started out boldly enough, but grew narrow and rough after a few miles, and dwindled into rock-studded hills, or lost themselves in a morass of red mirror mud or black cotton soil in the flat country and the valleys. On a map they looked sturdy and incapable of deceit, but to have ventured from Nairobi south toward Machakos or Magadi in anything less formidable than a moderately powered John Deere tractor was optimistic to the point of sheer whimsy, and the road to the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, north and west through Naivasha, called practicable in the dry season, had, when I had last used it after a mild rain, an adhesive quality equal to that of the most prized black treacle. This minor defect, coupled with the fact that thousands of miles of papyrus swamp and deeper desert lie between Naivasha and Khartoum, had been almost flippantly overlooked by a government road commission, which had caused the erection near Naivasha of an impressive and beautiful signpost reading, "To Juba, Khartoum, Cairo." I have never known whether this questionable encouragement to the casual traveler was only the result of a well-meant wishful thinking, or whether some official cursed with a depraved and sadistic humor had found an outlet for it after years of repression in a muggy Nairobi office. In any case, there stood the sign like a beacon, daring all and sundry to proceed, not even with caution, toward what was almost sure to be neither Khartoum nor Cairo, but a slough of despond more tangible than, but at least as hopeless as, Mr. Bunyan's. This was, of course, an exception. The more traveled roads were good and often paved for a short distance, but once the pavement ended, an aeroplane, if one were at hand, could save hours of weary toil behind the wheel of a lurching car, provided the driver was skillful enough to keep it lurching at all. My plane, though only a two-seater, was busy most of the time, in spite of competition from the then barely budding East African, not to say the full-blown Wilson, Airways. Nairobi itself was busy and growing, gateway to a still new country, a big country, an almost unknown country. In less than 30 years, the town had sprung from a collection of corrugated iron shacks serving the Spindley Uganda Railway to a sprawling welter of British, Boers, Indians, Somalis, Abyssinians, natives from all over Africa and a dozen other places. Today, its Indian bazaar alone covers several acres. Its hotels, its government offices, Its racecourse and its churches are imposing evidence that modern times and methods have at last caught up with East Africa, but the core of it is still raw and hardly softened at all by the weighty hand of British officialdom. Business goes on, banks flourish, automobiles purr importantly up and down Government Road, and shopgirls and clerks think, act, and live about as they do in any modern settlement of 30-odd thousand in any country, anywhere. The town lies snugly against the Athi Plains at the foot of the rolling Kikuyu Hills, looking north to Mount Kenya and south to Kilimanjaro in Tanganyika. It is a counting house in the wilderness, a place of shillings and pounds and land sales and trade, extraordinary successes and extraordinary failures. Its shops sell whatever you need to buy. Farms and coffee plantations surround it for more than 100 miles, and goods trains and lorries supply its markets with produce daily. But what is 100 miles in a country so big? Beyond are villages still sleeping in the forests on the great reservations, villages peopled with human beings only vaguely aware that the even course of their racial life may somehow be endangered by the persistent and irresistible pressure of the white man. But the white man's wars are fought on the edges of Africa. You can carry a machine gun 3,000 miles inland from the sea, and you are still on the edge of it. Since Carthage and before, men have hacked and scrabbled for permanent footholds along the coasts and in the deserts and on the mountains, and where those footholds have been secured, the right to hold them has been the cause of endless dispute and bloodshed. Competitors in conquest have overlooked the vital soul of Africa herself, from which emanates the true resistance to conquest. The soul is not dead, but silent, the wisdom not lacking, but of such simplicity as to be counted non-existent in the tinker's mind of modern civilization. Africa is of an ancient age, and the blood of many of her peoples is as venerable and as chaste as truth. What upstart race, sprung from some recent callow country to arm itself with steel and boastfulness, can match in the purity the blood of a single Masai Mirani, whose heritage may have stemmed not far from Eden? It is not the weed that is corrupt. Roots of the weed sucked first life from the genesis of earth and hold the essence of it still. Always the weed returns. The cultured plant retreats before it. Racial purity, true aristocracy, devolve not from edict nor from rote, but from the preservation of kinship with the elemental forces and purposes of life, whose understanding is not farther beyond the mind of a native shepherd than beyond the cultured fumblings of a mortar-board intelligence. Whatever happens, armies will continue to rumble. Colonies may change masters, and in the face of it all, Africa lies, and will lie, like a great, wisely somnolent giant, unmolested by the noisy drum rolling of bickering empires. It is not only a land, it is an entity born of one man's hope and another man's fancy.